All right, folks, in this chapter, we're going to talk about virtue ethics. Or at least once this little wheel stops spinning, we're going to. Okay, so we've talked so far about consequentialists and we've talked about Kantians, and they hold in common the idea that ethics is an answer to what should I do, right? What ought I to do? But the ethics of virtue emphasizes our virtues or moral characters. And so, as opposed to it being a theory that emphasizes duties or rules, it's really going to emphasize our virtue. And it's inspired by Aristotle. So, first concept that's kind of talked about in virtue ethics is the good life. Okay, so we're concerned about the sort of people we must become if we are to live the quote good life, an ethical life. So let's think about the behavior of helping someone who's in need. Okay, a utilitarian would say the consequences of helping maximize well-being. A deontologist would say we're following a moral rule. But a virtue ethicist would say helping people demonstrates my charitable or benevolent character, those virtues of being charitable and benevolent. So Aristotle presents a more subtle, rich, realistic picture of ethical life. So ethical knowledge involves a degree of wisdom or judgment, and it's not following absolute rules. It's focused instead on what kind of person should I be. So I think if you take this approach, I think this is an approach that also works really well for criminal justice. So it's also very rooted in the concept of virtues and vices, which are the opposites of each other, right? So virtues are our strengths of character, whereas vices are our weaknesses, right? And these both either promote or hinder how we flourish as a human being. So what is a virtue? Virtues are personal qualities, and we show them through habitual action. And they're qualities that make us comprise our excellent character. So this could include natural qualities like intelligence, things that we learn or acquire, things related to our temperament. And what do these values consist of? And what are these qualities good? Why are they good for a person to have? So first of all, how do we develop virtuous character? Well, we have to make it a habit to practice behaviors that reflect those virtues. So it's the repetition of these virtuous actions. Once that character is formed, it becomes the source of our virtuous actions. So when we abstain from pleasures, we become self-controlled. Once we're self-controlled, we're even better able to abstain from those pleasures. So let's think about honesty as a virtue, right? It's not enough to just tell the truth when it works to your advantage. An honest person is someone who's truthful as a matter of course, regardless of the outcome. So virtuous action has to become habitual. It has to become a habit. When it becomes a habit, then it becomes part of your fixed character, as opposed to something that you've done once or twice. Even when we have a natural inclination to be virtuous, we have to continue training to become habitually virtuous. Okay, and where do we get those traits? We get them from our parents, from teachers, from the law, from our community. So, a virtuous person is going to demand of themselves the highest degree of excellence of which they're capable. So let's think about lying. It's not wrong because it violates someone's right to truth. It's dishonest, and dishonesty is a vice. Wrongful killing is contrary to the virtue of charity. So Aristotle has a very long list, but there's 4 or 5 primary virtues: wisdom, courage, temperance, justice, and piety. Aristotle discusses a dozen, but he doesn't include justice or wisdom. Here's Aristotle's virtues: benevolence, civility, courteousness, generosity, tolerance, self-discipline. You can see the list here. So each virtue has its own special features, and some raise distinctive issues. What does it mean to have courage? Is a terrorist courageous? Is a Nazi courageous? In terms of generosity, how much is enough to give? A utilitarian would say you have a duty to do what produces the best overall consequences, but that could have a severe constraint on your day-to-day life. A virtue ethicist would say you give as much as is consistent with conducting your ordinary lives in a minimally satisfying way. So, to be a good person, deontologists say you do what is right. Virtue ethics say you be a good person morally. So even though someone may possess many of the qualities we talked about earlier, they may not have moral integrity. And virtues are necessary for conducting our lives well. So Aristotle talks also about happiness, and this is translated into the notions of flourishing and well-being. Okay, happiness is a good to which all of our human actions should be directed, and it's an activity of the should in accordance with perfect virtue. So it's not static, but it's rather an activity. It accompanies activities as opposed to being the goal of them. Virtues and vices could be understood in this context. So virtues are strengths of character that promote human flourishing and well-being. Vices are weaknesses that hinder human flourishing or well-being. So happiness becomes a way of doing things. Example, maybe someone has a virtue of not being defeated by their circumstances. So then moral norms should be seen as rules that tell us how to live and direct us toward realizing our own good. So flourishing arises out of virtuous activities. All things have a function or activity. Not just anything counts as playing an instrument. I could certainly pick up a guitar and start playing it, but I don't think any of you would call me, a guitar player. There's standards built into it. And human beings also have a function. And a flourishing life is one that's of excellence and distinctively human activity. So our function is not simply biological. Our function is, quote, an activity of soul exhibiting excellence. So what do we do when we have to make practical decisions? We can see we have these two extremes, right? The virtue or vice, and a mean or average between them. That mean lies between excess and a deficiency. So ethically, there's different correct ways of living for different people. What may be good for one person may not be good for another, and the correct way can only be discovered through trial and error. So here we have some examples, right? Let's look at this one on the bottom, right? Pride is the golden mean between being vain or being humble. So Aristotle emphasizes the way in which well-being and flourishing relate to practical wisdom. So people of practical wisdom are those people who can effectively deliberate about what's good for their life as a whole, as opposed to what may be the quickest, most expedient thing to do. And this involves applying excellent character to a situation in light of an overall conception of what amounts to a good life. So let's think about the difference between a clever person and a wise person. A clever person knows the best means to a particular end, but doesn't have the wisdom to understand which ends are worth pursuing. A wise person knows how to achieve an end and which ends are worth achieving. It's impossible for a person to know what to aim for when considering courses of action unless she was already virtuous. So, keep in mind that Aristotle is writing at a particular time in history where the community is an essential component of the social life. Okay? The political aspect of community was an essential aspect of well-being and flourishing, and they wanted to have the educated, best citizens of the best city-state. But virtues were not considered to be available to all. So to be magnanimous or generous, those were for people of rich or high status. What are some criticisms of the golden mean? Well, there's some places where it might not work. What's the middle truth between keeping a promise and not keeping one? The golden mean also proposes that happiness will result from moderate behavior, but moderation does not suit some people. At the time that, Aristotle is writing, ethics are for the ruling class, the privileged, free, adult Greek males, okay? Women and slaves could not decide for themselves. This list of virtues is arbitrary, and it fails to tell us how to act. Some responses to those criticisms, though, are that virtue ethics can provide action guidance. If you're thinking about what kind of person do you want to be, what kind of police officer do you want to be, what kind of person who works with children do you want to be, what kind of corrections officer do you want to be? So, for example, let's think about divulging a friend's confidence in order to be entertaining or keeping quiet. Well, loyalty is an integral part of friendship. So what would a loyal person do? So the reasons for doing an act relate to whether the act is honest, generous, and fair. And the reasons for not doing it relate to being dishonest and unfair. So different virtues can lead us in different directions. And those directions may conflict with each other. The virtue of charity may prompt me to kill a person who would be better off dead, but the virtue of justice forbids it. But deontologists also face this problem. So how do we apply virtue ethics? Rodney's a rookie police officer assigned to a mainly white middle-class neighborhood. On his shift, Rodney and his partner Max, a more senior officer, are patrolling the neighborhood. Max says, "Hey, look at that kid. He doesn't belong here. Let's question him." Rodney stops. He and Max get out. They approach the boy and ask him for identification. The boy produces his identification, asks the two officers, "Why have you stopped me? Is it because I'm black?" They don't respond, and Max just searches him and then arrests him. Later that night, Max tells Rodney that the boy pissed him off with his attitude, and he tells Rodney to write a report of the incident and charge the boy with loitering. So we've again got this stuff from chapter 1. Is Rodney faced with an ethical dilemma? So for virtue ethics, regardless of the dilemma, you have to ask yourself, what kind of person do you want to be? In this case, what kind of police officer does Rodney want to be? I might say that a virtuous police officer is honest, has integrity, has respect for the individual, is fair, civil, courageous, and self-disciplined. So then I have to think, if I'm Rodney, what virtues allow me to become the best police officer I can be? Okay? Courage, honesty, fairness, respect for the dignity of the individual. Once I've decided what kind of person I want to be, I have to practice those virtues. So then we can think about this and we can think about what is the best course of action for Rodney. What is the most virtuous action, right? The option of writing the report doesn't satisfy these virtues. The option of telling Max to write his own report satisfies some virtues, but does not really do much in terms of treating Rodney's human dignity. Reporting it to a supervisor satisfies all those virtues. So then what Rodney has to do is continue to practice those virtues until they become habit, therefore part of his character, and then in the future when he faces these dilemmas, he's going to know what to do. And that wraps up virtue ethics.